Coming up on River City Presents, we're going to be discussing overrated presidents with Professor of History at WKCTC, Brent Taylor. Welcome to River City Presents. My name's Daniel Hurt. Last time we talked about underrated presidents. Now we're going to talk about overrated presidents. Who are these folks that get too good of a reputation, but maybe it's not as deserved as we think? We're looking just at the presidential administrations too. Keep that in mind with both of these. But joining me on the program again is Professor of History at WKCTC, Brent Taylor. Welcome back.
Yeah, it seems like it's been a long time since I've seen you.
Indeed, yes, wardrobe changes and all, yes indeed.
Right?
So, do you have the list?
I do. I'm a little scared though. Overrated. People get a little antsy about overrated.
They're going to hate mine. It's going to be fine.
Okay, all right. I do have the list.
All right. Who have you got as your first choice for your overrated president?
All right. Super controversial, number 5, overrated president, John Adams.
John Adams overrated?
Exactly. When you get the falsetto response, you know that things are going wrong.
What's going on with this?
So John Adams, again, only the presidential administration. So we don't get to count all of the awesome founding father stuff because, see, he gets by on that.
I'm still mad, though. Go on.
See, he gets to coast along with all those guys. But then, once we actually have a country, we actually have a president, we've got a guy here who's a one-term guy. So some of our one-termers we've had on our other list.
But that's part of his magic.
Yeah, you got it all done in 4, right? Like Polk. So he's a one-term guy. It's a pretty contentious time. We came off of having Washington where everybody agrees that he's the man. But in his case, he's got this ultra rivalry going on with Thomas Jefferson. And more importantly, that two-party system is really taking hold at this time. And so he's having trouble there. His main thing is going to be trouble with foreign policy. And in a way, that's not his fault, but he is caught.
This is the French Revolution, right?
Yeah. So then all this spin-off and aftermath of that. And the next thing you know, England and France are upset with each other. And our top 2 trading partners are England and France. And navigating that is a hard thing to do.
And you have a vice president that doesn't want to go along with you on this too.
Yeah, right, because of the accidental nature of how we planned things. The two-party system was not within the bounds of the Constitution. It was extra-constitutional. The original thought there was you just put out your top slate of candidates. You please the majority, obviously, but then you also please a large minority by having their candidate become vice president.
It's sort of the preferential voting. The second choice gets to be the second spot. Yeah.
Yeah, forerunner of all that stuff. And just as a spoiler alert, we got rid of that system the first time around. And eventually we just go with the straight two-party system.
It's hard to imagine how that would play today. If like you had Vice President Donald Trump with President Joe Biden.
That's unbelievable to imagine.
Would be insane.
Just the dinner parties alone, where they're both in the same room, that would just blow everybody's mind.
And Big Macs at the same table. I mean,
with extra ketchup, right? Yeah. Yeah. So you've got. Of course, I like my things with extra ketchup too. But that is kind of an unbelievable. Now that's a bad situation for him. And the whole thing is, navigating that took all the oxygen out of the entire administration. And so when you start going to name the things that got done, it's really not a very long list.
Because the war absorbed it.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting because it reminds me of sort of how George H.W. Bush's administration is largely governed by the end of the Cold War, and he's a one-term president.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating. I see a little bit of a parallel there.
Yeah, both of those events are kind of way beyond each of their control.
It's more about management.
And maybe how it turned out. And then also one more thing with Adams, which is he was also part of the party that supported the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Jeffersonian Republicans were against those.
Well, you can't say nothing bad about the president or you got to go to jail.
That was the whole thing. Clearly unconstitutional. And so he's the face of that.
Jail would be so big now.
Oh, yeah, could you imagine? Twitter jail,
We're just
for
gonna
real.
round them all up. It's going to be just fine. But
You got it.
You know, the other thing, though, that I think that while you know, he's on your overrated list, the only thing I would say is the fact that you have a transition of power peacefully at the end of his term. It's not really a legacy item on his part, but it's just sort of the way that it plays out. He really is the first president to sort of hand it over after a defeat.
Right. Now, I think you undersold that a little bit. I think that really is part of his legacy. Because if you look at world history, forget American history, and you zoom out, and you go to world history, and you say, well, how many times in world history did power change hands from one faction to the other? And faction A just said, oh, shucks, see you in 2 to 4 years.
Yeah.
That is very unusual. They call it the Revolution of 1800 for a reason.
Yeah, because like there's a guy in some African country, I think, that's been there since like 1970, and you know, they had an election. He was like, I think our party's going to be fine, and everybody was like, yep, you'll be here forever. So
yeah, see, that's the world versus our system, which they're just different.
So on my list, I have Thomas Jefferson. So we'll just go from 2 to 3.
Oh,
Thomas
back
Jefferson's
to back.
overrated because, you know, you got to, so again, just presidencies.
Right.
Look, the guy wrote the Declaration of Independence. We get it.
But you can't count it.
But we can't count it. So, but you've got a guy who says he wants small government and then makes the largest land acquisition in history. I think it's interesting, that contradiction. Now, again, maybe he deserves credit for making the right decision. But if you look at his legacy on the domestic front and the foreign policy front during that time period, other than land acquisition, you don't really have any big items that jump out. And, you know, one of the negatives that I like to point out is it's his failure to build a navy and to utilize military conscription and to have any kind of defense force that leads to the War of 1812 going so badly when it's Madison's term. We had hardly any navy to speak of. And he doesn't rack up any accomplishments. It's sort of like he peaked at 32 when he wrote the Declaration and then just sort of like wandered about for the next 30 years. Thought about Monticello, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you're making some valid points there. The list of accomplishments is rather short. Maybe that's a part of his political philosophy, as you mentioned. The Democratic Republicans at that time are the small government party. There was actually kind of a controversy, kind of a question about whether or not it was constitutional to acquire Louisiana. And so they actually had to overcome that and say, well, upon further review, yeah, let's go ahead and do it to your point.
That you wrote, man. You're trying to.
Of course, he was out of town for that one.
Yeah,
but still, it's that is interesting. I'd say his biggest negative, as far as I was concerned, was how he dealt also with that same crisis that Adams dealt with. So that's ongoing. England, France hate each other. We're trying to be friends with both. It's almost like the breakup where you're supposed to pick one over the other and just forget that the other one exists, except we can't do that economically. And then our solution is the embargo. And that's clearly Jefferson's biggest mistake.
And that hurts our economy more than anybody.
Yeah, we basically said no foreign trade until we sort this out, which is very radical.
It'd been more interesting if they'd done, or I suppose it'd been more advantageous to trade with both until they'd figured it out. But that might have been.
We did that later.
But we got around to figuring it out.
Yeah. So in the aftermath, it was kind of like, well, okay, then we'll figure it, just like you said, figure it out at a later date. But that was all a big disaster. A lot of criticism, by the way, which, to Jefferson's credit, is now legal. You can see a lot of political cartoons criticizing Jefferson over the embargo. Whereas if you look for John Adams political cartoons,
well, you couldn't do it because it was illegal. So.
Not gonna find any. Exactly right.
You know, and that's interesting because you've got this. You know, Napoleon ends up coming out of that too, and so during all that same time, you know, the French Revolution leads to Napoleon, and there's basically a world war going on abroad. And, you know, maneuvering that as a small country like ours that needs both France and Britain on your side is a difficult task for any president. So
it hurt Adams and Jefferson, no question about that. And then, of course, on the plus sides for Jefferson, they allowed the Alien and Sedition Acts to just sunset. And so no renewal of that. So you can have free speech again, which is always a plus.
Yeah, that's right, because, it's one of those imagining America today where you can't do that. I mean, people can Google search whatever they want, and if you went to jail for that, it'd be pretty amazing.
Yeah.
You'd have to hire a lot more prison workers.
Exactly right.
Who have you got next on your list?
All right, so my number 4 overrated guy was actually a guy on your underrated list, if we think back to that.
Oh, no.
And I've got Jimmy Carter.
Oh, no. Carter overrated.
Yeah, and so...
How much more?
How much more can you take, right? That's true.
No one thinks that this guy is popular.
Well, that's the thing. You actually mentioned this in the previous episode. Go back and watch. You mentioned this there, which was, you said that there was a more recent attempt to rehabilitate.
You're saying don't do that. Okay.
right. Yeah. So now you made a lot of good points for Carter, for sure. Especially when you're looking at Egypt and Israel and all that stuff. That's big. Cannot undersell that at all. I would say on the overrated side, you've still got that economy. Stagflation, and it just dragged on year after year after year. And those are hard issues. But still,
Gas lines.
the gas lines,
Which we've never been able to, we've never, I suppose, had the lack of privilege to understand, but.
Just during the ice storm, for about 10 minutes, there was a gas line.
And everybody went insane.
Fist fights.
Yeah.
So there's definitely that. There's also, with the Malays speech, we talked about how there was kind of a hopeful tone to it, but there was also sort of an exasperated tone to it.
A guy that's just like, I don't know what's going on. So
Yeah. So that speech is complicated.
Yeah.
Now that we talk about it a little bit more, it was very complicated.
It's one of my favorites just because of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Then you're talking about, again, we mentioned this during the underrated, the hostage crisis.
Yeah.
And how that's just, the time is ticking away, tick, 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 and all those are days that are going by. And eventually you're at 444 days.
Yeah.
That's a very long time.
The other one is the operation, the military operation that's a failure. What's it called?
They said they were going to send in the little special op unit, and then it just everything went wrong.
The helicopter crashed or something, right?
Yeah, everything went haywire with it. So that's just another thing. From an optic standpoint alone, so you're doing nothing. Now we're going to do something. Horrible failure.
Yeah.
And then now we're back to doing nothing
And
again.
that reminds me of, I think it was when President Obama was going to do the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound. I think when they debated going back and forth on that, they were in the Situation Room and they were like, should we do it? Should we not do it? Should we just blow the building up? Or should we go in and make sure we got him? And there was sort of this undertone of, you don't want to be Jimmy Carter, because if you do it and it goes badly, that's what you're going to be. That could make or break your presidency. And on his occasion, it was successful, and they did get him. But with Carter, it's luck of the draw, man, I suppose. It just doesn't work out. That's it. But you're going to get stuck with it regardless.
You swing for the fence, and sometimes you hit a 500-footer.
Yeah.
And sometimes it goes right into the catcher's mitt.
And on that, when that was bungled, Ronald Reagan was able to be like, well, if I had been president, this is what. Not being president is sort of the best thing ever, because you can just point and be like, man, if I was in charge, we'd be doing it that way. It's like, but you might not if you were there.
Yeah, the armchair quarterback thing is always a luxury.
Yeah. I don't know. On my list, though, I'm going to do it again. So we went from 2 to 3. Now I'm going to go, mine's overrated, Ronald Reagan. So
okay.
We're just going to go right after Carter, Ronald Reagan. You sort of hear some of my complaints about Reagan already. It's like.
All right, well, I could. Well, what's funny is I sort of considered
putting him on
several names throughout that era there, yeah.
Well, let me get through my reasons, and I want to hear what your reasons are, too, because it's interesting that you would think about that as well. So this is a guy who said, I'm going to do a lot of things, and he's claimed credit. His legacy is that he gets credit for a lot of things that I don't necessarily think he deserves credit for. So, like the Iran hostage crisis solution. Jimmy Carter's the one, during the inauguration, still negotiating, still getting him on the plane. But Reagan's the one that gets pinned with, he brought the hostages home because he talked a good game. he's sort of like Trump in that he knows how to play the media game, and he's an actor, so he's got that.
The great communicator.
Absolutely. And then the other big one is Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Guy just said tear the wall down. He didn't do anything. He just suggested that they do it. So like,
They did it.
my deal is you can just, you should tear the wall down. But then under Bush is when it ultimately does happen, and then there's that management of the crisis. It's not really a crisis for us, but it's the management of the end of the Cold War. All of that legacy, I think, goes to Reagan, whereas it was actually Bush, which is why he's on my underrated, that sort of actually literally manages all those things: the wall, the unification of Germany, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and not Reagan. And then under Reagan, you've got savings and loan, which isn't exactly good for the economy. You've got Iran-Contra. You've got all these illegal activities going on in Central America. And then, of course, there's the Oliver North hearings, which make Dick Cheney a household name. But, he sort of goes on trial and does the I did it for my country thing. And, all those are bad optics. And then Reagan says, well, I didn't really know. In my heart, I thought I was doing the right thing. It's like, come on, man. Come on.
But he's got this quality where he gets away with things.
Yeah, he just says, well, and then they just let him do whatever he wants.
Right, yeah. So, that's interesting. There are some black marks there.
But I think those are all really fair criticisms of his administration. I think, he tried doing trickle-down economics, but maybe it's ideological, but I'm going to argue that is not necessarily the most successful policy based on the economy that we have seen. But at the same time, maybe Clinton claims credit for a good economy because it comes from Bush or Reagan. I mean, it's difficult to say, but those are sort of the reasons that I lay out that I thought Reagan was overrated, claiming credit for things he doesn't deserve, and not exactly the most stellar domestic policy agenda either. So what went into you at least considering putting him on the list?
Okay, so there was the strike with the airline traffic control workers. So that was kind of one thing. That's a tough situation. It almost reminds you of like a Grover Cleveland kind of situation where you've got things that are shutting down, but they're vital for national interests. In Cleveland's case, it was the mail. We cannot let a railroad strike shut down the mail. That kind of a thing, and so with Reagan, it was kind of like, well, you can't let the airports just all shut down.
Yeah.
But that's tricky though, and then also he did the 1986 amnesty. That's got a huge legacy, and people kind of throw around, well, let's do an amnesty and all these things, but we've done one.
Yeah.
And so if it was that effective, then
you hear all
what's
this
the deal?
negativity today, and it's like, well, actually, we did that in the 80s too. So, yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting thing. I mean, there are several things that you could look at Reagan and say, well, that's maybe not necessarily the best outcome. Then on the other hand, if you're going to try to fight for Reagan a little bit, you can say that the tax revenues did go up with Reaganomics. Mm-hmm. That's clear. Now, did Congress spend more than that? Yeah. Did the president sign off on that? Yeah. That might be more to your point about being overrated, because you're the small government guy and you're going to sign on to all those things with bipartisan deals and so on. So you can do it. It's like every presidency, you get a little mixed bag.
See, he's just the big one. It's like we like shot holes in the big guy. But
yeah.
Who you got next on your list?
All right, so my number 3 overrated president was someone you had on your underrated list.
Oh, come on.
I know. It's like we planned it, but we didn't plan it. It's George H.W. Bush.
What is going on here? You're starting to upset me.
So what I did, I spied on your list, and I just went backwards just to get a rise out of you. So with Bush, he's a coattail guy, so he gets in on Reagan's coattails. And a really stellar resume, which we discussed.
Yeah.
So he had both of those things going for him. In terms of here, I guess really this is what I really thought. There's breaking the campaign promise.
Yep.
Which is something of a betrayal even if it is for the right reasons,
Oh, yeah.
and even if you're working out bipartisan way, which we all say we want to be bipartisan, and then when someone's bipartisan, people are, what are you doing? So, I mean, I guess he just got the worst end of that.
He sure did, yeah.
And then when we talk about the Desert Storm, as I was thinking about that, I thought, well, I wonder if this is more like a gateway war, where you do one of these and then it leads you to getting into another one and another one. And possibly another one.
Maybe his son comes along to finish the job.
Well, right. So I mean,
We're just getting started here with the wars. You know.
exactly.
That is a very interesting choice. I mean, like you say, it's bad politically for the party, and his activity during the campaign ended up leading to him governing in such a way that poorly affected his future. So on mine, the next one on my list, we're just going to do it again, Bill Clinton.
Okay.
We're just going to keep
on Overrated.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, maybe I don't have the best defense of this one, but I'll explain why I chose what I did. Okay. I think that the policies that he pursued, he runs for office as this middle class, working class guy. And then he gets in office and supports what started in the earlier administration's NAFTA program, which ends up, putting a lot of people out of work, because you have a situation where it's like, if I can pay $19.90, you're going to pay $27 for a DVD, but you're going to have to pay the workers $30 an hour plus benefits. Or you can pay $9.99 for a DVD and ship those jobs overseas and pay those guys pennies for nothing. What is the business going to do? They're going to pick the cheaper option. What's the consumer going to do? They're going to pick the cheaper option. And so I would argue that Bill Clinton's policies did more to harm the economy, at least in terms of the sort of the middle income, labor, working family type job, than it did help the economy. Where he talks about doing well is those high level, high tech jobs of the future that are coming. And they do. They just don't come to Mayfield. They go to Louisville, they go to New York, they go to Chicago, the urban centers where people have college degrees. They don't necessarily come to the places that lost jobs. And I think you have this guy who's run for, campaigning for other people, wins re-election on all this, working hard for working families, and I just don't think that that's fair. But at the same time, he's working bipartisan with Newt Gingrich and Trent Lott, so you've got a lot of bipartisan support there. You've got a lot of people that you wouldn't think that you could work with, and you've got Simpson that's got a budget that's really good. So to be fair, you had a good budget, but on the other hand, I'm skeptical when it comes to his legacy of working people.
What you just described was the giant sucking sound.
That Ross
Perot criticized for in the election campaign. Yeah, that's exactly right. And when you look back at that, the free trade people had been on a big roll for a long time, really going back decades before all that. And that's kind of like the culmination of it is NAFTA. And you can definitely see where, like you said, the business, if the choice is you pay 1/40th of the labor in a different country, it's the obvious mathematical choice.
And the consumer is not going to be, unfortunately, we talk about this Buy American stuff, and it's like, well, they talk a good game, but are they actually going to do it? Probably not, unfortunately.
Sometimes it depends a little bit on the quality of the product, but a lot of times, though, you go in there, you see the first thing, well, this is $1.68. This thing costs $4.12, $1.68.
Yeah.
Looks like a similar product.
Yeah.
So it does become kind of obvious from the consumer standpoint as well.
But Clinton does have, foreign policy. He gets the Palestinian-Israeli Accords going on in the late 90s. He's got, the Kosovo conflict in Yugoslavia, all that going on. He's got some bright points, but I just feel, and I think he's a good president overall, but I just think that it's unfair to label the guy as this great president that deserves to be in the top tier. And we won't even get started on his personal behavior, but
well, that's a whole different thing.
That's not technically part of this, but
of course, it did happen during the administration. Right?
Come on, guy.
So technically, it's in bounds.
Come on, guy.
Right.
But what do you got on yours? I mean, do you think that's fair before we move on? Do you think that's a fair overrated listing, or do you think that I got that one wrong?
If people do have him in the near great category, I'd say that's completely fair.
Yeah.
I mean, I've always kind of viewed him as somewhere in the middle. Not in the failure categories by any stretch of the imagination, because just the budget surpluses alone.
Oh man, it's amazing.
When you're talking about recent times, I mean, the last time we talked about something like this was Andrew Jackson, right? Well, now, of course, he had the whole national debt at zero, and Clinton had a surplus for a couple of years. But given all the budgets that we've had since then, you would trade any of those
the ticker
for
tape
Clinton's
on
budgets.
how much money we owe now. So
Yes.
Well, what do you got next on your list there?
So at number 2, I don't know if you can handle this one or not. So
break my heart.
John Adams started you off. But at number 2, we've got FDR.
What are you doing? That's like my number 2 ever. He's my second favorite president behind Lincoln. Come on.
Okay, now we're going to put an asterisk on it, and we're going to say that it's not because he's not great, because he is.
Yeah, all right.
He is clearly at least in the near great category,
I'm glad.
just in terms of
I'm
greatness.
glad you clarified.
Yeah. So he is. But at the same time, you can be there and still be overrated. You've got a guy here who's got majorities that are unbelievable. So he can pass anything that he wants.
That's right.
Anything. There's no opposition. There's no headwind. All that was thanks to the Great Depression. So he got to come in. He got to play armchair quarterback. So when Hoover was struggling, what we would do.
Hoovervilles.
That guy's in Hooverville. You need to come down to FDRville.
Yeah.
So he got to play all those same things. He came into office.
Yep.
But more importantly, anyone with an R in parentheses next to the name was thrown out.
Yeah.
And it really got, we talked about this the other day, it got to where there were 17 Republican senators. 17. That's unbelievable. That you could put them all in a phone booth.
So they're having a meeting at the Cracker Barrel in the back. I made a joke about that the other day.
Yeah, exactly right. So really, at that point, Congress is a rubber stamp. You can pass anything that you want to pass. So in that way, there's a little bit of overratedness, if we can coin a term. And then there's also some dangerous things with FDR, which is things like the court packing scheme.
Yeah.
Hey, I don't like the way the court rules. Let's just put all kinds of new members on the court. I get to appoint them.
But isn't that fascinating itself that someone who has super majorities ends up passing legislation that the Supreme Court's just like, no. Because it means that the court took it upon themselves to oppose him because the Congress wasn't.
Yeah.
So it's just fascinating to see that. But yeah, you're right, the court packing plan. Like, I don't like your decision, so I'll just add more of you until I...
Yeah, I get to a point. That's so even people in his own party said, whoa, let's pump the brakes on that a little bit. And then there's the breaking of the 2-term tradition. So, term 3, better a third-termer than a third-rater.
I mean, I like
Great
it.
line,
I'm
great
all
line.
for it. Yeah.
Until we really analyze, is it? And then you do the 4th term.
Yeah.
And at that point, die in office, you were president for life.
Yeah. That's right.
And so then we had to go back later and say,
change the rules. Yeah.
We got to change the rules. We got to say, you know what? How about the 2-term tradition becomes law?
Yeah.
Just like Washington set out so many years ago.
That's fascinating. I don't really have a problem with more than 2 terms, but I certainly understand why they would have rules in place to make sure you can't keep going. Because, what if he's unpopular with a huge demographic of people and you just keep going and keep going and keep going? It's an interesting phenomenon. So for mine, I put on my second one, I put Grant on there. Ulysses S. Grant on my overrated list.
That's interesting to me because he's typically viewed near the bottom. So you think he should be way, way, way at the bottom?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of that one, I thought more about the character again, that like there's this perception that Grant is a great president because he's a Civil War guy.
Oh.
But like he's not. His administration had scandal, a domestic policy that was weak. He just sort of held the chair down for 8 years, I give him credit because he went out and fought the Klan. He went out and put that stuff down.
That's
he
the big
managed Reconstruction pretty well. You had, African American senators and congressmen in the South at a time when, after Reconstruction, the troops came out of the South, and after '77, don't get to go back for nearly a century later. You're still not having diverse representation in the South. But I just see him as someone who everyone gives him credit for being a good president just because he was a good general, and I don't think that's a fair assessment.
Oh, right. Yeah, if he's going to be writing that alone, then that really doesn't count. And there was a reason that we set that rule up that way for this discussion, because what he did on the battlefield, I mean, that wasn't even all that great, to be honest.
Yeah.
It was, he had the numbers and he had the will.
They were just marching.
Now he had an iron will.
Death machine.
And the generals before him did not, and that's why Lincoln preferred him. But yeah, just as an administration goes, I do feel sorry for Grant a little bit. The more I read about him, the more I believe he was a good guy, and he wanted things to go well, and he wanted all the right outcomes. Played by circumstance. Also, this is weird about him. One of his criticisms is that he was too honest. Isn't that an unusual criticism? And then it was like this thing in psychology where you do projection. And so he goes into the swamp, Washington, D.C., and he believes that everybody's telling him the truth because he always tells the truth.
Sort of like Jimmy Carter, kind of.
Oh, that's such a great parallel.
Yeah.
What great person.
Yeah.
But some questionable things in the administration.
Guy, you got to get better at lying. What are you doing?
Yeah, right.
We need you to learn how to be a good liar. That's what
Isn't that interesting? Because we always say that we want someone honest in politics.
Mr. President, did your administration do it? No.
Right.
No.
And you got to be very yes. All right, I admit it. We did it.
All right. Well, let's get down to the last one. Who's your final choice on overrated?
All right. You're not going to like it.
It's not going to beat mine.
You're not going to like it.
On.
Number one, overrated president, Woodrow Wilson.
Come on, man.
I knew it was going to kill you. I knew it was going to kill you. So here's a guy, and I think my primary thing was I read all of these books about him written in the 60s.
Me too.
Okay. Oh, so we read the same books. Now that's an interesting conclusion. So
I don't know.
The whole thing was, they said this guy was the ultimate world peace guy. He had it. He had it all figured out.
I mean, if they just listened to him, right?
And so then I did some more math, and I said, well, this was written in 1963.
How's that?
Wasn't there another conflict between 1918 and 1963?
Yeah.
Some small skirmish somewhere?
Some really big historical event. Yeah. Yeah, maybe.
Right. So he was the world peace guy, and he didn't actually bring world peace.
He, in fact, brought his failure, and the failure of the League of Nations ultimately led to a larger and worse conflict. So, I mean, I certainly understand that. I would just argue that because it was unable to be seen through its full fruition, that that is a legacy item in that it set the stage for what would become a corrected version of that after World War II.
Right. He also had some self-inflicted things.
Yeah.
So when he was at the cusp of actually getting approval, ratification for the League of Nations, he took the super hardline stance. Big battle with the Senate and lost. When he maybe could have done some sort of compromise deal there, gotten the ratification, then maybe you change the whole course of things.
When you're on a mission from God, though, you have to have it your way, 100%. He wrote in his diary, I believe that I am on a mission from God. He wants me to be president. He wants me to pass the civil rights, whatever, law or whatever it may be. Probably not civil rights, but workers' rights or something.
Yeah.
But it's like when you believe that you have a messianic cause, you're not so inclined to compromise. And I think that you're right. That is definitely a weakness on his part. Are you ready for mine?
I am.
My number one overrated, John F. Kennedy.
I thought it might be.
Yeah.
I thought it might be. And it's not without good reason. So go ahead and explain.
Other than the Cuban Missile Crisis, there is nothing you can point to. Maybe that's exaggerated, but wants to get civil rights done. Can't get civil rights done. It's a close election with Nixon. He gets bogged down, right? Can't get civil rights done. Can't get any of the real domestic policy initiatives that he wants to do. He goes over and meets with Khrushchev and sort of gets treated like the little boy. And then he says the ultimate phrase, East Germany is yours, West Germany is ours. He actually says it explicitly, and they're like, wait, what was that? Did you just legitimize our right to have the East? And then when they talk about Berlin in the same way, the Berlin Wall gets built in '61 under his leadership, and they managed that by going, well, let's just roll some tanks up there, so that's going to help, you know. And I think that you have unnecessary tensions. I think he handled foreign policy poorly up to that point. You have the Bay of Pigs, which is just a bungled activity. We said we were going to support these Cuban exiles. They go in. We don't really support them. We give them just enough equipment to be useless, so they believe they might win, and then they don't. But you know, a lot of the things that he, you know, I'm just surprised by the fact that a lot of people give him this, like, you know, Camelot sort of heroic imagery of the presidency, when, you know, all those domestic policy agendas, your underrated list, Lyndon Johnson gets everything he wants done.
And
more, because he's the machine politics guy who knows how to do it, and he doesn't get bogged down like Kennedy does. He might have been able to benefit in '64 from Kennedy's death, you know, this sort of sad, you know, the Democrats win in retrospect. But, and then, to be fair though, I think Kennedy deserves recognition because, you know, his historical background, which we don't count because it's just the administration,
right,
but he learns from his mistakes. He learns from Bay of Pigs. He learns not to be a victim of groupthink. And when he is tested with arguably the most serious and most dangerous outcome in the history of our country, when you're faced with that, he handled it as well as one could and saved the world. If not for his success, none of us potentially could be here.
He was resolute.
And so I know that is probably a surprise that I would knock Kennedy that hard, but it's like, guy couldn't get anything done and bungled foreign policy until he had to get it right, in which he did. But I don't think that it's fair to point to, and it's a short term. It's only 3 years of a presidency too, so
right,
it's a lot of incomplete. What could have happened if he'd gotten re-election? Could it have been the Johnson legacy? Who knows? But it didn't go that way.
That's his thing. And so I wasn't completely surprised by that. And I would definitely say, well, first of all, we got to say one thing to defend him. He did not, in fact, say that he was a jelly donut.
I don't.
Do you know this, Joe?
No.
So he goes over to Germany and gives this speech. Ich bin ein Berliner. So it's all one, we're all one Berlin, you know. And so some people down in the satirical depths of American culture said, you know what? There is a donut called a Berliner, and his German was so bad that he said, I am a jelly donut. He didn't actually do that.
See,
so we're gonna bump him up one rung just for that.
So I can't count that as a foreign policy bungle.
You can't count that as the bungle,
okay,
correct? But no, your point is very valid with JFK. If you do another blind resume test, and you say, okay, take away the Cuban Missile Crisis.
What do you got?
And you got a blank name there with this list.
That doesn't pass.
It doesn't necessarily pass.
That's a one-term president.
Potentially.
Yeah.
But then, in his death, you get all this martyrdom. And it's really kind of like, it's almost like Kurt Cobain and Mama Cass and Amy Winehouse all rolled into one.
What could have been, yeah.
Yeah, so people fill in the blank. It's almost like he's a blank slate, and people fill in, well, he would have gotten civil rights. And I have heard this, he wouldn't have gotten us into Vietnam. And so they fill in all these hypotheticals, and yeah, by the time you get hypothetical great president here, there it is.
And it's sort of, I think that's the thing with the Kennedys. And you know, I think a modern day version of this, and even though they're not dead, is like Bernie Sanders. Him not winning was arguably better for his cause than winning, because what if he'd won and not been able to get anything done? Now they always have the what could have been thing. So, I think that that's an interesting, parallel
The
there.
one that got away.
The one that got away. But we're out of time, but I thought this was a great deal of fun, and we'll be back another time to talk about something else, no doubt. I'm glad you come on the show as always.
Absolutely, thank you.
We'll be doing something else fun down the road. That was our show, Overrated Presidents. We'll hope you join us next time. Thank you.